up the essay that was due today because I thought it was due today at midnight. So I'm almost done with it, but I thought I had to like the rest of the day to complete it. Can you do that for us, or is that not possible?
No, that's no problem. I could give you a couple of days.
Okay, please, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll give you a couple of days on that.
Okay, thank
just
you.
To make sure that you have enough time to actually, put your thoughts together. Because as I said, it's very important to do the best you can on the first draft if you decide to submit the first draft, because your grade is going to depend on that.
Actually, Professor, I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
It said I already submitted it. It said 3 pages. So do you want it to be 3 pages full of content, or you count it by words, like how many words per page?
No, just 3 pages is fine. If you submitted 3 pages, that's fine. That shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, but then again, going back to the paper itself, the writing assignment, you have a choice. You either could submit initial draft, if you will. I don't like to call it an initial draft, because that will have the meaning on
like
the
a rough draft
that, hey, it's a rough copy. No, it's actually, you will be graded on that. You will be given a grade. Now, the thing that you will have as a result of submitting it as an initial draft is that you have the opportunity to see an improvement of about 10% to your grade. That's about it. Now, if you do a bad job and get, let's say, 60%, then the max you're going to get is 70%. You see what I'm saying here? That's why it's very important that if you want to submit an initial, you must make sure that you do your best in that initial submission. Otherwise, you can submit it at the end of the semester, during the final exam or whatever, and then you will be graded accordingly. And but then if you do that, then you don't have the opportunity of getting a 10% extra. But a lot of students, I guess, well, from my experience, basically, a lot of students opted for the second option, presenting it at the end of the semester, rather than presenting one initially and then having to go through the feedbacks and then end up with just 10 percentage points extra. So some students feel that that's really not worth it. They could use the time to do something else, basically. Well, it's up to you. As I said, you have the option, and you can use either. Okay. All right. Now, as far as the class presentation is concerned, excuse me, is there anyone who has not formed a group? Yes.
Sir, our group was supposed to present today.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no problem. But I'm talking about anyone who does not have a group, is left out. In other words, did not do any presentation and does not have a group. So that student is not presenting anything, basically. Now, this is a problem, and we're going to solve that, because, you're talking about each class presentation accounts for a certain percentage of your grade. So you don't want to end up with a 0 there. So anyone who hasn't, please let me know as soon as possible. Otherwise, we're going to start today with, let me see now who I have today. I guess it's, let me get my paper here. Right here. So we have Michael Coulson. Who else in the group? Who else?
Mohammed Bengloria, Michael Coulson, and Hugo.
Mohammed
and Hugo.
So you're 2?
And Hugo.
And can that person be?
Oh, Hugo.
Okay, Hugo Lizardi. So this way I can see your name properly. Lizardi. Okay, who do you want me to pass the thing to here?
You can pass it to me.
Okay, to Muhammad. All right, let's see where Muhammad is here. Okay. All right, you got it. You got it?
Yes.
All right. You can start whenever you're ready.
You all can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Hello, everyone. So today we are gonna present about city indicators, Morocco. My name is Mohammed Bengloria, and my team members are Michael Colson and Hugo Lizardi. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about who were the founders. So city founders and co-directors were political scientist Dr. David Lizardi, Dr. David Signali at Binghamton University, and Dr. David L. Richards at University of Connecticut. And then later on, Dr. K. Chad Clay at the University of Georgia joined the third co-director in 2013. So city, this define the city. So city indicators means the Singularly and Richards Human Rights Data Project. It was a non-profit project, and it provides human rights data for that provides information for various entities. And the reason behind the creation of this formation project was the City Human Rights Data Project provides information about government respect for a broad array of human rights in nearly every country in the world, covering about 30 years from 1981 to 2011. And they have 15 separate human rights practices and 195 countries. It is one of the largest human rights data sets in the world. The CD data were used in over 117 countries by scholars, students, policymakers, and analysts. This is the CD indicators ranking. So the ranking was based on a scale of 0 to 2 for the respect of human rights. 0 means frequent violation of this right, 1 means some violation of this right, and 2 means no reported violation of this right. So there are about 15 city indicators controlling human rights for models and several association. You can hear me?
Now I can hear you. We had some problems before, but okay, go ahead.
Maybe the internet is weak, I guess.
Probably.
So the city indicators, there are about 15 human rights: assembly and association, disappearance, domestic movement, electoral self-determination, empowerment right index, extrajudicial killing, foreign movement, independence of the judiciary, physical integrity right index, political imprisonment, religion, speech, torture, workers' right.
What is the foreign movement? What does that imply? Foreign movement.
That's imply foreign relations.
Okay, all right.
and
Go ahead.
women's rights. So today we are gonna present. Today we are gonna covering the key factors, some of the human rights and their violation. So now I'll pass over to Michael, and he will tell you about the Morocco GDP and economic right and some of the rights.
All right, thank you. So Morocco GDP, the gross domestic product GDP in Morocco was worth 118 billion US dollars in 2019. The GDP value of Morocco represent only 0.1% of the entire world economy. Morocco has the population of 36 millions as of 2018. And agriculture is the biggest account for the entire GDP of Morocco. It applies for 14% of GDP, but only employs 40 to 45% of the entire population. So most of the population in Morocco in agriculture, but it only accounts for 14%. Morocco ranks 123rd out of 189 in Human Development Index. And the following slide is the Morocco Economic Freedom Score. So as you can see, Morocco ranks 78 out of 189 when it comes to economic freedom score. And this accounts in the rule of law. That includes property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity, and also government size. This includes tax burden, government spending, and fiscal health. The third category for this economic freedom score is regulatory efficiency. This includes business freedom, labor freedom, and monetary freedom.
And what do you mean by the arrows there? Can you explain for us the arrows, the green arrows and the red arrows?
Sure. So the green arrow implies that the year 2020 has improved over the year 2019. So the green arrow indicates that for the year 2020, for example, 66.3, meaning that it has improved over the previous year.
Okay, good.
Can I have the next slide, please?
Yeah.
So Morocco's economic freedom score is 63.3, making it its economy the 78th in the 2020 index. Its overall score has increased by 0.4 point, reflecting an improved score for property rights. And Morocco is ranked 7th among 14 countries in the Middle East and North Africa regions, and its overall score is slightly higher than regional and world averages. The Moroccan economy is the moderately free category for 6 years in a row. GDP growth during that time has been solid. So we're gonna address the one of the serious indicators for Morocco, and that includes disappearance and political imprisonment. Hundreds of suspected government opponents, including over 500 people of Western Saharan origin and over 100 Moroccans, have disappeared since 1960s after being arrested by Moroccan security forces in 1991. After being held in secret detention for up to 19 years in appalling conditions, more than 300 of these prisoners were released after an international campaign on human rights violations in Morocco. Recent testimonies suggest that the reason for disappearance includes suspected or actual political opposition activities and disloyalty by the state servant. So the following slides are gonna be the pictures of the protests that happened in Morocco. Imprisonment of political activists. The following are the pictures of political protests that took place in 2018, demanding the release of 42 activists who had rallied against corruption and unemployment. Those who were captured faced between 15 to 20 years in prison. Among those, Nasser Zebzaki, the leader of political movement in 2016 named Iraq Rif. This movement originated from the death of Mokim Fikri, a fishmonger who was crushed to death after jumping into the back of the garbage truck trying to retrieve the fish that was confiscated by the government. And the following are the pictures that depicted the protest. And one of the serial indicators also include Human Development Index. The HDI is a composite index which takes into account three basic components of human development: longevity, education, and income per capita. The UN has ranked Morocco 123rd in its 2018 Human Development Index among 189 countries, down from 122 in 2016. And fun fact, Morocco ranks lower in Human Rights Index, Development Index, than Libya in the Middle East region. The labor force participation rate for people aged 15 and older, women participation in labor force is only 25%, a rate that is much lower than men, which is at a staggering 74%. Morocco life expectancy at birth was 76 years. That is 77 for women and 74.9 for men, higher than the average index of Arab states, which is only around 71. And for the gender inequality index, Morocco ranked 119th for 2017 with 0.482 out of 1. Women hold 18.4% in seats in the parliament, according to the report. A low gender inequality index value indicates low inequality between women and men, and vice versa. For labor force participation rate for people aged 15 and older, women's participation in the labor force is only 25%. Next slide.
So now we're going to talk about the religion of the Morocco. So what is the state religion of Morocco? The Constitution of Morocco establishes that Islam is the state religion of Morocco and also grants freedom of thought, expression, assembly, and the right for everyone to conduct their religious affairs. Morocco is ruled by King Mohammed, and he was ascended to the throne on 23rd July 1999 upon the death of his father, King Hassan. He is ruling Morocco since 1999 to present. King Mohammed has generally been described as more liberal than his predecessors and has enacted reforms to improve the country's human rights records. And the freedom of religion. So freedom of religion in Morocco is limited. Building places of worship and performing rituals among Christians and Jews is limited. No evangelizing other religion apart from Islam. If you evangelize other religions, that earns 15 years in prison. And when the creation of Israel in 1948 leads to immigration of Jews in Morocco. The freedom of speech. The freedom of speech in Morocco is limited. Questioning the actions of the monarchy is considered a taboo. Questioning territorial integrity is illegal. Criticizing government through print or online media is civil punishable. According to CPJ, Morocco has been ranked top 10 backsliders in the speech freedom. Now Hugo will.
Okay. Oh, my bad. So in regards to women's political rights, in legislation election, there are only 20 seats reserved for women, and women are still a minority in their political system. Martial rape is still a large factor that it's unrecognized by law and the enforcers. The age of marriage has increased from 15 to 18 years old. However, there are many exceptions continually made by the Ministry of Justice to have adults marry minor girls. By 2003, women were legally able to select their husband. While women possess the ability to have equal rights, there are still barriers to effective implementation. And let's see. So women's economic rights. Labor codes protect women from a variety of discriminatory harassment, including race, sex, color, religion, ethnicity, and from disability. However, age and pregnancy are not considered in the labor code for many women. Although labor codes were established, discrimination still occurs in the information categories as the government lacks the resources to sustain the law adequately. For instance, a majority of women are forced to rely on their husbands for support because women are being denied money and property in their inheritances. The law essentially keeps women financially dependent on men. And women's social rights. Although the Constitution provides Moroccan women with equal civil, political, economic, cultural, and environmental rights as men, there is a huge issue revolving around inadequate enforcement. Inheritance is a large issue that still favors men. Women receive significantly less than half. Inheritance law is debated by men because they want to preserve tradition and follow the Quran's clear codes. The law of inheritance was based on the fact that men were head of the households. However, that isn't the case today. During the changing times, legal reforms have not been made and leave many women empty-handed.
Okay, very good. Any questions? Anyone has any question? No questions? Okay. Is that the end of it?
Yes.
No one has, in other words, we have completed the first class presentation. Anyone did not present? Because we're going to close the chapter on this. Okay, then why don't you go ahead and make me the host?
And how would I do that?
Yeah, you just go to click on my name and just make me the host.
Okay.
You got that?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, I guess today what we want to do is we want to continue with what we were doing last time, I guess, in chapter 3, if you remember, when we first start, unless anyone has any questions before we, does anyone have any questions before I start? Okay, so if no one has any questions, we will continue with chapter 3, where we left off from chapter 3. If you remember, we were talking about the type of government. In other words, we were talking about the types of regimes in the MENA region. What type of regimes are there, and what type of governance is there for these regimes, and what are the most important factors in determining the strategies for economic development, political development, and social development. All of these things obviously are extremely important because when we talk about political regimes in the MENA region, political regimes is basically the system that can motivate, the system that can actually put economic plans and strategies, and it is the system that can design the appropriate trajectory for all types of development, whether it be social, economic, political. So the political system obviously is extremely important. And last time, of course, we pretty much talked about what a political regime is, what it includes. If you remember, we said that it refers to the type of government and the political structure that contains a definite ideology, which is used in guiding policies for every country. So a political regime is extremely important. However, when you look at the MENA region, and I'm not trying to tell you here that you know, the MENA region or the countries in the MENA region are the worst. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm trying to say is simply pinpoint the weaknesses in these countries. And there are also strengths, and we will look at the strengths as well. But for now, we just want to see why, for example, these countries have underperformed. And when I say underperformed, I don't simply mean underperforming from an economic point of view, but I'm talking about economic, social, political. In other words, you see the underperformance in all of these sectors. And our task here and the objective or the goal is to find out why. Why have these countries underperformed? What really pulled them back? Or what are the main stumbling blocks, if you will, that actually kept these countries from progressing, from advancing, from doing well? And this is something that, you know, we're going to discuss here. Obviously, some have said that the reason why these countries have underperformed is simply because of the political structure. The political structure that these countries have is not conducive for economic development, for social development. And that's the reason why they have been held backward. And, you know, there are certain arguments that say, no, this is not the case. In other words, you can look at other countries who pretty much have the same political structure, the same political organizations, but they have done pretty well economically and socially. So in other words, you can't say because a country does not or is not democratic, then this country is going to face problems in as far as the development trajectories are concerned. That's not a very good argument. That's not a very good argument to use, simply because you can see that there are a lot of countries who have nothing to do with democracy. Their political system is pretty much dictatorial, but they have done pretty well. And a good example of that would be China, for example. China is not a democracy, but China has been able to do extremely well in terms of its economic progress and the social advances that China has made in the recent past. So we can't use that as simply an excuse, if you will, for saying, well, the reason why the MENA region has not done so well is simply because of the types of political regimes that it espouses, and that's completely wrong. It may be part, you know, I mean, there is an element of truth in that, yes, but it's not the whole thing. So there are other factors as well that have contributed to the region of not doing well economically, politically and socially. And we will look at all of those in just a minute. But this is basically what we were doing last time. We were trying to see what type of regimes the MENA region have. And we said last time that the MENA region is pretty much divided between monarchies and republics. So some of them are monarchies and some are republics. And when it comes to both monarchies and republics, they are both authoritarian regimes. So you have a monarchy, which is an absolute monarchy. It's not a constitutional monarchies. We don't have any constitutional monarchies in the MENA region. They're pretty much absolute monarchies. And they are pretty much authoritarian in nature. as well as we have republic regimes, and those are also authoritarian in nature as well. The only exception in the MENA region is probably Lebanon. Lebanon does have some sort of democracy, even though the kind of democracy that Lebanon has is not a perfect democracy. In other words, the democracy that Lebanon has is pretty much based on sectarianism. It's based on religion. In other words, it's based on political agreements that the Lebanese people have obviously come to bring forth between the different sects, the different religions. And there are so many sects, so many religions in Lebanon, and they felt that the best way to govern that country is through sharing power. And for that reason, because their democracy is based on power sharing, it has made it extremely difficult to pursue viable economic, political, and social policies that can actually lead to the advancement of the country. And we see a good example of it right now, what's happening in Lebanon right now. It's pretty much highly chaotic. In other words, you'll see that foreign countries have actually intervened at the request of the Lebanese political leaders themselves to try and find solutions to the political problem that Lebanon is facing today. In other words, they can't come up with an agreement on forming a government, basically. Each party wants the government to be formed in a certain way. And you have all these different political forces that don't want to be left out. In other words, they don't want to be marginalized. They still want to be part of the political system. They're afraid that if they form a government that does not include these political parties, then these political parties will lose a lot of their power. So right now, there is no government in Lebanon. And this is a problem. In other words, the former prime minister has resigned, and his cabinet also resigned as a result of pressure from the people, wanting to see a change simply because of the corruption and because of the weaknesses in making decisions, political decisions. And the government succumbed to the wishes of the people and they resigned. So the prime minister and his cabinet, all of them resigned. So in the meantime, they were able to name a new prime minister, but this new prime minister is not able to form a government. Why? Because he does not have the consensus from all the political parties agreeing to the type of government that he wants to have. He pretty much wants to have a government that consists of independent bureaucrats. In other words, bureaucrats that have no political leanings to anyone. And it's very difficult, for example, to find someone in Lebanon who does not have political leanings, who does not have an agenda. It's very difficult to find that. But according to this new prime minister, he believes he has that group of people that he can put together and form a government. And those people are obviously not tied to any political party. Now, this is obviously causing a lot of problems in Lebanon. And the prime minister cannot form a government because he obviously needs the consent of parliament to do that. And right now, the majority of parliament lies with pretty much 3 political parties. So they are the ones who can actually call the shot here. They are the ones who can determine whether the government will be able to gain their support or not. And so far, these 3 major political parties in Lebanon have refused to go along with the prime minister, the newly formed prime minister, who feels that he pretty much doesn't want to include any members in the cabinet that belongs to any of these political parties. So this is a huge problem right now. So there's a stalemate. And this is one of the problems of the democracies of Lebanon. It's not a perfect democracy. Why? Because it's pretty much based on getting a consensus among the different sects, the different religions in Lebanon. And if these sects and these religions don't agree on one particular policy, then that policy is not going to pass. Now, regardless of whether you have a majority or you don't have a majority. So in fact, this whole thing about majority really doesn't mean much in Lebanon. The majority in parliament obviously belongs to these three major political parties, but these three major political parties, they can't do much. Pretty much they are in a stalemate right now. And the president of France is trying to help by obviously smoothing the conflict, if you will, between the different sects, and is trying to convince everyone that they need to agree on a government as soon as possible. Because if you don't have a government, then obviously all these economic ills that Lebanon is going through, and the political ills as well in terms of corruption, etc., are not going to be solved. And there's simply not going to be any foreign help coming to Lebanon, because right now Lebanon needs foreign financial help. If it doesn't get that, then the whole Lebanese economy will tank, basically. And you're going to have riots, you're going to have huge unemployment. And so far, of course, the Lebanese lira has depreciated tremendously against the US dollar, probably over 100% depreciation, which really doesn't vote well for the Lebanese economy at all. And Lebanese debts are, national debts are also increasing, especially now with the lira depreciating by over 100%. This puts added pressure on the national debt of Lebanon. So it's a huge problem. It's a complete fiasco. I mean, I myself, I don't know how Lebanon is going to find its way out of the predicament that it is in right now. And all of that has to do with the type of government that Lebanon is pursuing, which is a democracy that is based on consensus. And you just can't have that, unfortunately. So they're having problems. And we also talked about state building in the MENA region. And state building, of course, is extremely important, because this is really one thing that these countries need, is they need to have a modern state. And in fact, in as far as state building is concerned, a lot of countries in the MENA region have actually shown a decline in state building. In other words, when these countries got their independence from European colonialists during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I guess the last one to gain independence is Algeria in 1962 from France. So basically, those countries, when they first excuse me. So when these countries got their independence from these different colonialist powers, they were actually on the right path towards building a modern state. And they did a pretty good job of putting the right seeds in trying to come up with a modern state, a viable state. and they were pretty much successful. But you can see that during the late 70s and early 80s, the trend started going down. So instead of continuing the progress, the advances that they have made since their independence, they actually now are showing signs of weaknesses in as far as state building is concerned. That's really where we need to look at, if you will. This is the time period that we want to focus on. In other words, what has happened to the countries in the MENA region during that period, when we saw that these countries are actually showing a downward trend in as far as building modern states is concerned. And as we will see later on when we talk about, we will take a few case studies, and we will probably look at Egypt as a case study. We will look at Iran also as another case study. We will look at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, basically as case studies. And also, we will probably look at, it's very difficult to look at all these countries because that's going to take a long time really going over each country and seeing exactly where they went wrong and how they were not able to continue in the process of state building. It's very difficult to do that, but as I said, we will just pick a few. Now, look at what was happening in the early 50s, 60s, and 70s. These countries, as they were coming out of the colonial rules, if you will, as they were gaining their independence, some countries, especially Egypt, Algeria, Iraq, Syria, and Tunis, these countries were pretty much trying to emulate the model that was used by Ataturk. The Ataturk, who is actually the founding father of modern Turkey in 1922. He was able to develop a sophisticated set of governing institutions to actually administer Turkey, and he borrowed this, by the way, from the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire basically it's one of the greatest empires that existed in history. In other words, the Ottoman Empire pretty much ruled much of the MENA from the 13th century through the early 20th century. And the Ottoman Empire was pretty much responsible for developing a sophisticated set of governing institutions, which Ataturk pretty much borrowed a lot from. And the reason why they actually developed this sophisticated set of governing institutions is because the Ottoman Empire was trying to administer a huge geographical area. In other words, you're talking about all of North Africa, and you're talking about the Middle East all the way to the border of Iran. And then you're talking about Southeastern Europe. All of this was under the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was a huge empire that was responsible for controlling and ruling over a huge geographical area. And this obviously forced the Ottoman Empire to come up with the right tools, efficient tools, to try and administer this huge geographical area. So they were pretty much had a large bureaucracy and a very efficient bureaucracy, by the way, which is mind-boggling. Now, usually, you know, when we talk about bureaucracy, we talk about red tape and we talk about inefficiency. But if you look at the large bureaucracy that was developed by the Ottoman Empire, it was extremely efficient. And they also had a large professional army, very strong army, and this is really what kept the Ottoman Empire in control of its territory, simply because of the um, huge army that it was able to develop. And it also developed an elaborate set of legal codes. So they pretty much had rules and regulations for everything. They pretty much had a lot of the institutions regulated under legal codes, which obviously made things a lot easier for them to run and to control and to administer. When you have legal codes, it really simplifies things for you. It clarifies a lot of things and defines everything according to what the legal code entails. So everyone knows exactly what they need to do, and they're pretty much directed by this legal code. So the elaborate set of legal codes that the Ottoman Empire was able to develop was used to the advantage of the Ottoman Empire. And also there was a large clerical staff that run the courts and other state institutions. And this clerical staff were pretty much highly educated and highly efficient in their roles, which obviously made things easier. Now, these legacies of the Ottoman and the colonial rule, also the colonial rules of Italy, France, and Britain, they also had some positive impact on the MENA region. Now, there were some negative impacts, yes, but we cannot ignore that this colonialist did have also some positive impacts. And so the legacies of the Ottoman rule and the colonial rule have shaped these modern states of the MENA region. And one of the things that was pretty much used to the advantage of the modern states of the MENA region was the Ataturk model. That, again, as I said, was presented by Kemal Mustafa Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, in 1923, and was pretty much instrumental in building all of these modern states that we see in the MENA region, especially, as I said, Egypt, Tunis, Iraq, Syria. All of these countries pretty much used the Ataturk model to make advances in the building of their modern states. Like we said last time, the Ataturk model obviously is defined by a single party political system. In other words, Ataturk was pretty much interested in having one or a single political party. And the reason is simply because he felt that if you have several political parties in a country, these parties will probably be fighting against one another for power, and they will be wasting most of their time in vying for power rather than for trying to find solutions to economic, political, and social problems of the country. So he felt that a single party political system will do a much better job than a multi-party political system. And so the Ataturk model was pretty much based on a single party political system. That's why you see that in most Arab countries, you only have one political party. In Egypt, for example, after independence, the political party that ruled in Egypt was simply the ASU, the Arab Socialist Union, ASU, the Arab Socialist Union Party, under President Nasser of Egypt. And we will talk about that in just a few minutes. And then the Ataturk model was also defined by secularism, in other words, separation of church and state. In other words, religious leaders really have no place in politics, and they should not be putting forward their own thinking or beliefs in order to run the state. You have to separate them completely. And then the state must be the center stage of everything. In other words, the state must play a dominant role in all aspects of life. In other words, in education, in health, in business, you name it. The state must play a major role in all these things that I just talked about. So in all aspects of life, the state happens to be holding the key. And this is basically how a lot of the countries in the MENA region, especially the countries that had a republic regime. In other words, monarchies are a little bit different. The monarchies were not very much interested or excited about using the Ataturk model. But you see that all the republic regimes in the MENA region were pretty much persuaded by the Ataturk model as a way out of backwardness, as a way out towards advances, towards building a modern state, etc. So modern states, again, by definition, when we talk about modern states, we're simply talking about those that will have the ability to organize and control its political and economic resources on a national scale. That's what a modern state is all about. And for states to be successful and avoid being called failed states, they obviously must preserve state capacity that reflects good governance. Now, what did we say about state capacity? Does everyone remember what state capacity is? Anyone? We talked a lot about state capacity. What do we mean by state capacity?
Are you referring to the state's capacity in like resources?
No, state capacity in governing.
The
Like how-
ability
And
to
that has
keep
to be
yourself.
part of it. Resources has to be part of that. In other words, when a state is successful, when a state is has state capacity, if you will, it is successful, it is doing well, it's not being labeled as a failed state, it is effective in ruling. That has to do with resources as well, the way you use your resources. Are you using resources in a way that will better society as a whole, or are you using those resources to better only a segment of society? So yes, resources is basically a part of state capacity, it's a part of governance. All of these things are pretty much tied together. But when we talk about state capacity here, what we have in mind is the ability for government bureaucrats or decision makers to actually be effective in designing and implementing policies. That's what state capacity means. The ability of state bureaucrats, to design and implement viable policies that will ultimately lead to the right development trajectory. And this development trajectory can be in economics, can be in politics, can be in social, whatever the case may be. But that's basically what is meant by state capacity. And countries can actually be labeled as failed states simply because they don't have that state capacity. So state capacity reflects good governance. And that's what we mean by state capacity. So in other words, and then again, what do we mean by governance? By now, obviously, all of you would know what governance is from the class presentations. Hopefully, you should have a good idea of what governance is, but just for those of you who missed it a little bit here or there, it's simply a combination of the political, economic, and social factors that will affect the behavior of organizations and individuals and will influence their performance. That's what governance is. So governance is simply a combination of all the political, economic, and social factors that may affect the behavior of organizations and individuals and influencing their performance. And when we talk about governance, we're talking about things such as the rule of law. In other words, we're talking about property rights here, court system, police force. All of this has to do with the rule of law. So in order to have good governance, a country must have obviously put together a good system that adheres to the respect of the rule of law. And the rule of law must always include things such as property rights. Because if property rights are not included in the rule of law, then this will create chaos. Because that's basically what property rights does. It guarantees you that once you own something and you have the proof that you own it, no one else can come and take it away from you. And this simply means that we are living in a country that adheres to the rule of law. Otherwise, if we don't have the rule of law, we will have the law of the jungle, basically. And that's what you end up with. So the rule of law is extremely important. And property rights go nicely with that, as well as a court system. You have to have a court system and you have to have a police force. Because if you don't have those two, then property rights will mean very little. And then government effectiveness. And when we talk about government effectiveness here, we're simply talking about the quality of public services and civil services, the quality of policy formulations, and the credibility of government. All of that has to do with government effectiveness. All of that would tell me if the government is doing a good job or not. Is the government effective in what it's supposed to be doing? And then, of course, human rights. That's also another important element of governance. Human rights, violence and repression. So the more human rights we have, the more respect for human rights we have, the better off society is going to be, because you will probably have a pretty much peaceful society when the human rights of everyone are being respected. And there's going to be less violence, there will be less repression, and this will bring political stability. And with political stability, you're going to have economic progress and economic development. So all of these things are pretty much tied together. And then the lack of corruption and transparency. Now, if the governing body, or if the state or the government, call it whatever you want, has no transparency and no accountability for their actions, then this ruling body or ruling organization can go amok, if you will, in trying to do whatever it wants without worrying about being held accountable for the decisions that they make. So accountability is extremely important. You have to have accountability if you have to have good governance. And this government must adhere to the lack of corruption. In other words, corruption must be reduced to the minimum possible. Because it's very, very difficult to completely get rid of corruption. That's not something that's feasible. I mean, there is no country in the world that does not have some corruption. But what you want to do here is you want to try to limit it as much as possible, reduce corruption. And you know, the only way you can do that is obviously through accountability and transparency. The more transparent and the more accountable a government is to its citizens, the less of a corruption you can expect. And unfortunately, in the MENA region, I don't know, sometimes, you know, I do have my arguments against some authors who try and show that there is lack of corruption in a lot of the GCC countries, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. They showed them as doing extremely well when it comes to the CPI index, the corruption perception index, CPI, and transparency. And they show that these governments are very transparent. To the contrary, there is a lot of corruption taking place in the GCC countries, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar. So for these authors to show that these countries have an extremely high score on government effectiveness or on human rights or on lack of corruption and transparency, I find that very, very difficult to digest. Yes,
Professor,
yeah.
even when I made my point of saying that Qatar had a low lack of corruption, I did include the fact that they were governed by like a dictator, so they didn't have to hide so much.
Yeah,
that was my point.
Absolutely. Yeah, you made a good point here. Absolutely, you're right, and I agree with you 100%. Yes. So, you know, I mean, all these numbers and all these statistics that are presented in many studies, we have to be extremely careful in how we interpret these numbers. And we really have to dig deep beyond these numbers to find any relevancy in as far as the governance is concerned, or as far as state capacity is concerned in a lot of these countries. Now, obviously, in the GCC countries, one of the reasons why they showed that they are doing a lot better than the other regions like the RRLA or the RPLA is simply because these countries are pretty much washed with money, and they could use that money to actually make their population happy, their citizens happy, and as a result, you will not see any protests, demonstrations. You will see a lot of more political stability, and that political stability will bring in economic progress, etc., etc. But at the same time, we must not ignore the fact that as far as human rights, violence, and repression, it exists in these countries as well. And corruption also exists, especially among government officials, especially amongst the rulers. You look at Saudi Arabia, for example. If there is any country that is corrupt, it's probably Saudi Arabia. The king and the crown princess of Saudi Arabia, and probably there are what? There are probably close to 500 or 600 princes in Saudi Arabia. And each prince is given a bank account from the day that they were born in tens of millions of dollars. And they're given a salary, even if they don't work, in millions of dollars a year. So now you're telling me that there is no corruption there? Absolutely. High levels of corruption. And then, of course, if you look at a lot of these deals that are made between the Saudi Arabian government and European countries, whether it's France, Britain, Germany, or even the US, between the government in Saudi Arabia and the US government, for example. A lot of kickbacks. In fact, look at how much money the daughter of President Trump was able to get from Saudi Arabia. Probably close to $500 million. Were given to, I forgot her name now. What's her name? What's the name of Trump's daughter?
Ivanka?
Ivanka, right. I mean, she got about close to $500 million for the past 4 years thrown into her organization. She has a nonprofit organization, I guess, of some sort. And she was able to lure a lot of money from Saudi Arabia, from the United Arab Emirates, from Qatar, and all the GCC countries. So there is a lot of corruption. And there is basically no transparency. Has anyone come to us and told us exactly what this money was given for? If it wasn't for the US telling us what Ivanka got from Saudi Arabia, you will never hear about it. So there is a lot of corruption. And unfortunately, the citizens of those countries have to pay dearly for all of that corruption. And this is basically one of the reasons why a lot of these countries have not been doing so well. One reason is corruption, because corruption really sucks a lot of resources that are needed for economic development. It takes it out completely from the economy. It takes it somewhere else. So there is a huge opportunity cost to corruption. And who pays this huge opportunity cost? The citizens, the people of that region. So that's a huge problem. Okay, so that's basically governance, and there are several agencies that are responsible for measuring the various dimensions of governance, and we talked about all of that, so I really don't want to repeat it. I'm sure most of you know by now what the worldwide governance indicators are, who publishes them, what do they mean. So I'm not really not going to go through that, as well as the Physical Integrity Rights Index and the Empowerment Rights Index. Obviously, who publishes them, the CIRI, Sigrinelli-Richards, both on a country and regional level. And all these indicators happen to measure the violations of human rights. So, and then we have the Corruption Perception Index, which is published by Transparency International and is pretty much used to measure the level of corruption. So in all of these indicators, the resource-rich, labor-poor exhibits the highest estimates, followed by the resource-poor, labor-abundant, and then ranked last is the resource-rich, labor-abundant region. So it seems like the GCC countries, again, are doing very well according to all these indexes that we saw, versus the resource-rich, labor-abundant. The resource-poor come in the middle, basically, between the two. So resource-rich, labor-poor doing very well. Resource-rich, labor-abundant doing extremely bad. And then in the middle, you have the resource-poor, labor-abundant countries. And again, like we said before, and I don't want to repeat myself, that political regimes are broadly divided into the authoritarian republics. And all these authoritarian republics are found mainly in the resource-poor, labor-abundant, and resource-rich, labor abundant, where power is pretty much maintained and consolidated through co-optation and repression. In other words, the carrot and the stick that we talked about before. And they all share the following institutional and socio-political commonalities, such as a single party dominance, secularism, and quasi-socialist policies. So they're pretty much similar to the Ataturk model. And this is something that I mentioned earlier on, that it is the authoritarian republics that happen to be pretty much influenced by the Ataturk model. When we talk about quasi-socialist policies here, what do we mean is that all the policies are not 100% socialist. In other words, there is room for the marketplace, the forces of demand and supply, to actually determine the direction of where resources ought to go, and also of how resources are being distributed. So yes, on the whole part, the socialist policies are extremely important. In other words, they're simply made by the government, basically. But again, the government does allow room for the marketplace to function in terms of demand and supply. So because of that, we say we have a quasi-socialist policies, not 100% socialist, quasi. So there's a mixture, basically. And then we also have the authoritarian monarchs. And these are found mainly in the resource-rich, labor-poor, in other words, the GCC countries, and also in the resource-poor, labor-abundant. And in the resource-poor, labor-abundant, it's basically Jordan. And in the resource-rich, labor-poor, it's basically Morocco. So those are the only monarchies that we have. And then, of course, the GCC, they're mostly monarchies. So we have Morocco, Jordan, and then we have the GCC countries. Those are authoritarian monarchs, where power here, of course, is maintained and consolidated through patronage and the formation of extensive social coalitions. So here you really don't see the stick and the carrot. You basically see mostly carrot. The stick is really not invoked that much here. And this is basically one of the reasons why when we talk about the indices, in as far as human rights, etc., you know, the GCC countries happen to be doing a lot better simply because they use more of the carrot and less of the stick in actually governing over the people. So it's all done through patronage and the formation of extensive social coalitions. In other words, they're pretty much interested in broadening the social coalitions, having more and more people become members of those social coalitions, so as to reduce the amount of conflict and to increase the amount of agreement. And then, of course, in the GCC countries, you have the Sharia law, which pretty much plays a prominent role in the social and legal systems and in the economic system, which is based more on liberalism and private market forces, which obviously, as we will see later on when we talk about Islam, Sharia law pretty much favors the market forces, basically, and favors liberalism in the sense that individuals are free to actually attain wealth, if you will. So there's really no restrictions on individuals to attain wealth, but once they attain that wealth, well, Sharia law has a different purpose for what they need to do with that wealth. There are rules and regulations. So Sharia law allows you to amass as much wealth as you would, or you are able to. But then Sharia law dictates on how this wealth is to be used. In other words, Sharia law does not allow for the exploitation, does not allow for people to run amok with their capital power in exploiting other human beings. So yeah, there are certain rules and regulations pertaining to how that power, wealth in this case, ought to be used. Well, but we will talk about it when we get to it. But that's basically what Sharia law is. Sharia law is simply basically law that is based on Islam, basically on the Quran, whatever the Quran, which is the Islamic holy book, says about certain things. So, and as I said, we will talk quite extensively about Sharia law when we get to it. Now, according to Freedom House in 2014, they did evaluations of political regimes, and they found that the MENA is pretty much classified as not free. So this really tells you something about the MENA region in as far as their political endeavor is concerned. Now, before we go to chapter 4, as I said, I will just pick a few countries and we will just go over those countries in terms of their economic, political, and social trajectories when it comes to development. And we will pretty much try and see the difference between, for example, Egypt, which happens to be a authoritarian republic, versus Saudi Arabia, which happens to be an authoritarian monarch, and just compare and contrast governance, economic development, or other development trajectories for both countries. And we will try to see if we can, which country did better than which, and if we can have any explanations for that. So we will stop right there. Are there any questions?
Professor, just to clarify, when you were talking earlier about the authoritarian monarchies, Jordan was research poor, labor poor, and Morocco was resource rich, labor poor?
No, Morocco should be resource poor, labor abundant, RPLA. That's how Morocco should be.
Okay.
And also Jordan, by the way, resource poor, labor abundant.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't get those down,
Yeah,
but I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Any other question?
Professor?
Yes.
For those that submitted the rough draft-ish type of copy, how long of a turnaround should we expect? A couple weeks?
Oh, yeah, probably, I will give you the scores or the feedbacks in about a couple of weeks.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Professor, for the midterm exam, is it next week or?
No, I will let you know. It's not going to be next week, no.
Okay.
But I will let you know beforehand. I'll give you plenty of time to actually prepare for it. But once we finish chapter 4, that's when we will have and I guess, it's going to take us probably, I would say, I don't know. It's going to take us another session to finish chapter 3 because I need to go over these 2 countries that I just talked about. And then chapter 4 probably would take us, I don't know, maybe 3-4 sessions. So 2 sessions is equivalent to 1 week. So 2 weeks there, then, we're going to have 1 week just to prepare and to have a study guide, if you will, for the midterm. So, tentatively, you're talking about 4 weeks, in 4 weeks.
I remember I saw the exam one is due October 20th, something like that. So maybe
that's
around that range.
Yeah, that's tentative. So I will let you know exactly when the exam is going to be.
Okay.
Will the class presentation grades be up
Today.
Oh, okay.
Today you will have them. You know, right now I have one more class, and once I finish with that class, then I will go back to my laptop and start putting things together for you.
Thank you.
How much extra time do we have for the draft?
Oh, I'm going to give you a couple of days more.
Okay.
So I'm going to
Like maybe-
extend it. I'm going to extend it to, what's today? Today is Tuesday. I'm going to extend it to Thursday.
Okay, thank you.
And Professor, if we already submit it, can we resubmit it or so?
Yeah, you can resubmit. Okay. Yeah, as many times as
we need to change anything. Okay.
Amazing.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm gonna take a look at it one more time.
Okay. Yeah, and then, you know, if you are not happy with it, resubmit it.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other question? See, I'm here to make things easy for you, not to make things difficult.
Yeah.
Because after all, you know, the learning process should be facilitated, not made harder. My philosophy basically is, you know, we're here to learn. So in order to learn, I need to facilitate the environment of learning. And whatever I can do to facilitate things, you know, this is what I believe in, even though sometimes, you know, I am in conflict with my department in as far as this is concerned. They really like to make things difficult, but because they feel like, hey, you know, they want to keep standards up because they're worried that, you know, they don't want standards. Yeah, but, you know, I mean, there are certain ways of keeping those standards up, not by making things difficult. No, I don't think that, you know, I don't buy that. But, you know, we have different philosophies, I must admit, and usually we argue in meetings. Well, you know, when I'm in a meeting with faculty, we do argue, and I happen to have a different perspective on these things from many other faculty members. Unfortunately, I always lose because I'm in the minority, but, you know, it is what it is. I mean, I have to voice my opinion whenever I can, and usually I do. And I'm not shy of doing that at all costs. It doesn't worry me. But yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, but I have to run because I have another class right now.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.